people have like they have 4 fundamental fears. One is fear of their own inadequacy and malevolence. That's a big fear, man. That can really do you in if you confront it accidentally and fully. Happens to soldiers sometimes in battle when they find themselves doing things they can't believe they do. And then we're afraid of society. That would be the oppressive patriarchy, because society judges us harshly and mercilessly in many ways, and we don't like to plummet in the, what would you call it? We don't like to see our reputation savaged in front of the groups that we identify with. It's extraordinarily hard on us emotionally for that to happen. Rule 1, which is a chapter, at least in part, that details out the fact that the neurochemical systems that track your comparative status in competence hierarchies also regulate the balance between your positive and negative emotion, such that if you suffer a social defeat, your proclivity to experience negative emotion radically increases, and your proclivity to experience positive emotion radically decreases. And people seriously do not like that. And it's no wonder, because who wants to be completely overwhelmed with sadness and bitterness and anxiety and resentment and disappointment and frustration and grief, and then also devoid of happiness? It's the very definition of hell. And if a status defeat will increase that probability, then we will fight very hard to maintain our status positions, which we certainly do. That's another fear. And then, of course, we have the fear of nature, and we should, because, of course, nature, despite being the environment and this thing that we should be striving to protect and maintain, is also trying with all of its might constantly to make us ill and old and kill us, and is generally very successful at all 3. And so there's every reason to be afraid of nature. And then people are also afraid of the unknown. And so those are the big categories of terror that human beings face. And I thought, I see, this is one of the things that really makes people different than animals. It's like, it's one thing to realize that you're naked. To realize that you're naked means that you know that you're limited in time and space, that you're mortal, and that you're subject to degeneration and to social humiliation and to your own harsh judgment. All of that nakedness, to know that you're vulnerable against the world, and definitely a source of shame because of that, and a felt lack of self-sufficiency. And no wonder. It's understandable. But the other thing is that this is the rub. It's like if you're out in the veldt and you're not being very careful, and a hungry lion jumps on you and eats you, you don't really think of the lion as evil. I mean, you might right at that moment, but philosophically, it's not evil, it's just hungry. And as soon as it's not hungry, then it goes and has a sleep, and it's not up to some malevolent trick. It's done for the day. But human being, that's a whole different sort of creature. And because human being is capable of doing terrible things to someone else, and consciously so. Think, well, what's the connection between that and nakedness itself? And it seems to be this, is like, here's the thing, is that once I realize that I can be hurt, I have a self-conscious model of my own vulnerability, then I can generalize that to other people. I can think, oh, this is interesting. Here's how I can be hurt by myself. Here's how I can be hurt by society. Here's how I can be hurt by nature and by the unknown. And what that implies is that, well, you can be hurt with exactly the same mechanisms. And that immediately becomes part of my, what would you say, my repertoire of ability. And then all of a sudden the world is no longer a walled garden and a well-watered place, but it's a moral story, because with that ability to inflict suffering comes the knowledge of good and evil. As far as I'm concerned, those are identical propositions, because now we have the choice, a deep choice about how we're going to treat ourselves and each other. We can inflict tremendous pain and suffering on each other in a very voluntary and conscious manner in a way that no other animal can manage. And that's the dawning of the moral sense, that capacity we now have to choose to mitigate or exaggerate suffering. We're constantly exposing its weaknesses and vulnerabilities and, let's say, nakedness. And there's nothing wrong with criticism, but the thing about criticism is the purpose of criticism is to separate the wheat from the chaff. It's not to burn everything to the ground, right? It's to say, well, we're going to carefully look at this. We're going to carefully differentiate. We're going to keep what's good and we're going to move away from what's bad. But the point of the criticism isn't to identify everything as bad. It's to separate what's good from what's bad so that you can retain what's good and move towards it. Thinking about how to remediate social systems, because obviously they need careful attention and adjustment. And it struck me that the proper strategy for implementing social change is to stay within your domain of competence. And that requires humility, which is a virtue that is never promoted in modern culture, I would say. It's a virtue that you can hardly even talk about. But humility means you're probably not as smart as you think you are, and you should be careful. And so then the question might be, well, okay, you should be careful, but perhaps you still want to do good, or you want to make some positive changes. How can you be careful and do good? And then I would say, well, you try not to step outside of the boundaries of your competence, and you start small, and you start with things that you actually could adjust, that you actually do understand, that you actually could fix. I mentioned to you at one point that one of the things Carl Jung said was that modern men don't see God because they don't look low enough. It's a very interesting phrase. And one of the things that I've been promoting, I suppose, online is the idea that you should restrict your attempts to fix things to what's at hand. So there's probably things about you that you could fix, right? Things that you know that aren't right. Not anyone else's opinion, your own opinion, that aren't right. You can fix them. Maybe there's some things that you could adjust in your family. Well, that gets hard. You have to have your act together a lot before you can start to adjust your family, because things can kick back on you really hard. And you think, well, it's hard to put yourself together. It's really hard to put your family together. Why the hell do you think you can put the world together? Right? Because obviously the world is more complicated than you and your family. And so if you're stymied in your attempts even to set your own house in order, which of course you are, then you would think that what that would do would be to make you very, very leery about announcing your broad-scale plans for social revolution. Well, it's a peculiar thing, because that isn't how it works, because people are much more likely to announce their plans for broad-scale social revolution than they are to try to set themselves straight or to set their family straight. And I think the reason for that is that as soon as they try to set themselves straight or their families, the system immediately kicks back at them, right? Instantly. Whereas if they announce their plans for large-scale social revolution, the lag between the announcement and the kickback is so long that they don't recognize that there's any error there. And so, you can get away with being wrong if nothing falls on you for a while. And it's also an incitement to hubris, because you can announce your plans for large-scale social revolution and stand back and you don't get hit by lightning, and you think, well, I might be right, even though you're not. You're seriously not right. I might be right, and then you think, well, how wonderful is that, especially if you could do it without any real effort. And I really do think, fundamentally, I believe that that's what universities teach students now. That's what they teach them to do. I really believe that. And I think it's absolutely appalling. And I think it's horribly dangerous, because it's not that easy to fix things, especially if you're not committed to it. And I think if you're committed, because what you try to do is you try to straighten out your own life first. And that's enough. Like I think it's a statement in the New Testament that it's more difficult to rule yourself than to rule a city. And that's not a metaphor. It's like all of you who've made announcements to yourself about changing your diet and going to the gym every January know perfectly well how difficult it is to regulate your own impulses and to bring yourself under the control of some, what would you say, well-structured and ethical, attentive structure of values. It's extraordinarily difficult, and so people don't do it, and instead they